All right, everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on this interesting Wednesday, Spring Wednesday here, at least in Ohio. My name is Kelsey Berkfeld. I am the Director of Advocates for Ohio's Future, and I'm very excited today to co-host this conversation, this opportunity to learn with our friends at Policy Matters Ohio. We know there's been a lot of action on the federal level in terms of new policy, relief bills and plans going out to the states. And today we will take some time to hear from some of our experts about the American Rescue Plan, specifically the tax provisions that will have implications here in Ohio, and also some, we always know some of our electeds like to stir up some trouble with these new policies coming down. So I am excited today to introduce Nick Johnson. He is the Senior Vice President for State Fiscal Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, as well as Zach Schiller. He is the Research Director at Policy Matters Ohio, today to tell us their understanding of the tax provisions and what the impact could have, and really what our state could experience over the next few months as we all get untangled from these new policies. Just a heads up, this discussion will be recorded. Folks who do attend and who registered for the event today will receive a link to the recording after we finished up today. We will be holding questions until the end of both Nick and Zach's presentation. Please let me know in the chat if you'd like to queue to ask a question at the end. We will invite you to unmute and ask your question verbally, or you can throw it in the chat as well. So you don't forget. I know that happens to me sometimes. So without any further ado, when you're ready, Nick, go ahead and kick us off.
Great, thanks so much, Kelsey. I really appreciate it. And great to be with all of you. Really appreciate the opportunity. We're in a remarkable moment, aren't we? The American Rescue Plan was truly historic. This federal government really stepping forward to meet the tremendous needs of the moment that exist on so many levels. Families and communities facing eviction and homelessness and hunger, loss of jobs in so many ways. And so it's always worth just stopping and reflecting on the enormity of what has just happened. And I know Ohio and other states are now turning to implementing all this and making sure families and communities gain access to the benefits as Congress deserved. One of the historic parts of this bill is the direct fiscal aid to states, local governments, tribal governments, and U.S. territories. $350 billion in relatively flexible funds that they can use to address the health, economic, and fiscal crisis that they are facing. This is substantially larger than what was provided by the federal government in the wake of the Great Recession of a few years ago. Even though I think the budget holes were larger back then, really dwarfs anything the federal government has done for states and localities in the past. And there was good reason to go big. The pandemic has led to this very big loss of state and local tax revenues. Now, normally every year tax revenues grow to meet population growth and inflation and to cover the cost of rising services like healthcare. But instead, taxes fell. Taxes fell steeply when the economy shut down. And even though tax revenues are now starting to come back and actually are starting to exceed expectations, right? So the estimates were taken way down. So now tax revenues are starting to exceed estimates, but there's still been a big drop off of tax revenue for states, and particularly in a lot of places for localities, particularly those that are highly dependent on office workers coming downtown, meals taxes, tourism taxes, and so on. The other thing that's happened to offset that a little bit on the tax revenue front is that folks who higher income folks, profitable corporations, are actually a lot of them are doing fine and continuing to pay income taxes. So that's offset the loss of tax revenue a bit. But it's still been a big hit on taxes, and it's been accompanied also by a huge increase in the needs that states have to address, and all the costs of changing the way they do business, as well as just addressing the direct impacts of the pandemic and attending to the needs of families, again, who are facing so much hardship. Historically, because states have to balance their budget at a time when they're facing reduced tax revenues and increased need for services, recessions were a time when states, if they did anything on their tax code, they raised taxes to meet increased needs. But that, in the last decade or so, that has changed. The advent of the Tea Party and the solidification of the belief among so many elected officials that tax cuts solve all problems, this resulted in a number of states moving very quickly to start cutting taxes out of this misguided idea that it would be a great way to jumpstart their economy. So we saw a number of states right after the Great Recession move quickly into tax cutting mode. So this year, as Congress was drafting the American Rescue Plan with this historic infusion of money on the table, even as it was going through the legislative process, we were starting to see some governors and legislatures start to talk openly about big tax cuts, which of course having all this flexible new money could facilitate. So Congress put in a provision into the American Rescue Plan that said, in effect, that if a state uses the money directly or indirectly to pay for tax cuts, it loses a commensurate amount of the federal aid. So as Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia said, and as you can imagine, he was key to the negotiations, how in the world would you cut your revenue during a pandemic and still need dollars? So the good news is that they didn't say, oh, all these governors are cutting taxes, that means states don't have any needs, and cut that $350 billion back. Instead, what they did, they put in this provision and basically said, yeah, you can't, if you enact a net tax cut, you will lose dollars. There's not a ton of detail in this provision. It's just a few sentences of language, but I think the intent is super clear. You can use federal dollars to make up for a loss of revenue that resulted from the pandemic and recession. But you can't use federal dollars to make up for a loss of revenue that results from cutting taxes. Now, some of you may know that the nation's Republican attorney generals wrote a long letter to the US Treasury complaining about this provision. I think they were arguably kind of trying to put the Treasury on notice that there might be legal action if they didn't write guidance that would just let states do whatever they want. And in fact, your Attorney General has already taken legal action. But Congress was pretty careful when they wrote this provision to make sure that it passes constitutional muster. Supreme Court Justice Roberts, a number of years ago, in his opinion on the Obamacare case, said that Congress can't use, for example, a state's entire Medicaid allotment to put a gun to the head of states to force them to enact specific policy changes. That was coercive, he said. But there's lots of legal precedent that the federal government can clearly put conditions on the use of funds. So for instance, the federal government can require states to have speed limits in order to access federal highway dollars. And this gun to the head argument is why Congress wrote this provision only to apply to net tax cuts. So the Treasury Secretary, in her response to the attorneys general, said it really pretty clearly. If you enact a tax cut with one hand, but increase revenues meanwhile, then you're paying for the tax cuts not with federal dollars, but with the other tax increase. So that's okay, you won't lose federal funds. The gun to head argument is also why the provision only lasts as long as the federal aid is available. It only runs to 2024. Now the provision is clear that a tax cut is not just a cut in a rate. It also applies to new or increased tax deductions, exemptions, credits, things like that. So anything that loses revenue. But we think there's a really important exception here. In the case of a refundable tax credit, like the federal EITC, federal law generally treats the refundable portion of the credit, in other words, the part of the credit that exceeds a family's income tax liability, as an expenditure, not as a tax cut. And so by that logic, if for instance, Ohio, were to take its current non-refundable EITC and make it refundable, in other words, to allow families to receive the full benefit of the credit regardless of their tax liability, that we would argue wouldn't be a tax cut and it wouldn't threaten the federal funds. Now, I should underscore, we haven't yet seen formal guidance from the Treasury. The ARP does give Treasury authority to write regulations about this, and we haven't seen any kinds of formal information from the Treasury other than this very short letter from the Treasury Secretary that would give more clarity to states. We're hopeful that the guidance will be really strong and emphasize that this is a real binding constraint on states, and just provide states the clarity that they need to navigate around it. But honestly, we don't know for sure yet. We are hoping to know soon, in a matter of weeks. The last thing I'll say is, there's also a policy question, right? There are some folks who think states should stick their thumbs in the eye of this provision and just go ahead and cut taxes anyway. They either because they think they'll win in court, they're chomping at the bit to go to court and take this to the Supreme Court and they'll win. They think they'll win, or because we know it's federal funds anyway. Just as we're an autonomous state, we don't need that federal money. Which is great red meat politically for the base. They get to simultaneously champion tax cuts and vilify the federal government. But from a policy perspective, that's a mistake. I think for three reasons, from a policy perspective, and then sort of one more practical reason. The main reason this is a mistake is there's just much more important uses for the funds. We're not mostly talking today about how to use that. States should use that $350 billion in local governments, but it's really pretty flexible money to address a range of economic and fiscal and health impacts resulting from the act, including filling gaps left elsewhere in the act. So, for instance, addressing the fact that there are a lot of benefit provisions that don't directly benefit some immigrant families. States can use this money to benefit immigrant families who aren't helped elsewhere. States can, there's a lot of K through 12 funding in this in the bill, but to the extent that that's not sufficient, the states could supplement there. So there's a lot of really important needs that states have that they can use this money for. The second thing to remember is that recessions are just a really terrible time for states to be cutting taxes. Even if they don't lose federal funds, they're losing their own money, right? So even if a state were to win this constitutional argument, they're still sending tax benefits to well-off families and profitable corporations that don't really need it at the expense of good things that they could be doing. Even in the long run, cutting taxes is a weak economic development strategy for states. The folks generating jobs, the employers who want to be out there creating jobs, they're just not paying a ton of attention to taxes. Investing in education, transportation, child development, these probably do at least as much to support state economies as tax cuts. And then I would finally argue that policymakers just should take a deep breath. Like there's really no rush here. States should be taking this moment to be shoring up their finances. If they really don't want to spend money on supporting families and communities, at a minimum, put the funds into reserves and to rainy day funds to prepare for the next recession, or crisis, pandemic, whatever. The federal constraint will end in 2024. At which point that won't exist anymore, and then we'll go back to our regular debate about cutting taxes versus protecting services. So this is a super interesting issue. It's really the first time the federal government has stepped in quite this way and had something to say about state tax policy, which has definitely ruffled a lot of feathers. I really do think that this is going to survive legal muster, and that states should be paying attention to it. But there are a lot of questions still to be answered when we see the guidance from the federal government. So I'm going to turn it over to Zach now to talk a little bit more about the Ohio-specific implications.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Nick. And we're happy to have you here in Ohio, at least electronically. I want to talk a little more about Ohio and what this means here specifically. Before I get into the details of that, I want to give you a very brief refresher course in some recent Ohio tax policy. So if you can go to the next slide. I won't run through all of this, but if you've been living in Ohio like I have over the past 15, 20 years, you'd know that we have done a whole succession of tax changes. And the two main things that this has accomplished is it has reduced the amount of revenue available to the state by $7 billion a year, which is a kind of mind-boggling amount. And at the same time, and all the things, of course, that we could have been spending that money on are now going out the window in tax cuts. And then next slide, please. Who has actually benefited from this? Well, this and the next slide are both brought to you by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, with whom we work closely. And it takes a look at the different people in different income groups and what's happened to them based on the major tax changes made in Ohio over this time period. And what is found is that we're giving the top 1% a $40,000 a year tax cut. People in the middle are basically breaking even. And the bottom 20% are actually seeing an increase of $100 plus a year in the amount of state and local taxes they pay on average. And what this has done, if you go to the next slide, is merely reinforce what had existed even before that, but was not as bad. Namely, while this is a little bit hard to read if you're not familiar with it, it basically shows each one of these bars is a different income group. The bar on the left is the bottom 20%. The bar on the right is the top 1%. And you can see that essentially the bottom, the poorest people in Ohio on average are paying almost twice as much in state and local taxes as the top 1%. And the people in between, middle income people, are also paying more than the very wealthiest do. And so this has been a product of our tax policy. And of course, as we know, since we've been here this time, this has not resulted in Ohio becoming the center of industry and population growth. To the contrary, we're likely to lose a congressional seat when the census is done with. Our incomes have slid further in relation to the national average, and our job growth has been subpar. So we have had a failure of tax policy, of major tax cuts over the past 15 years, which we don't want to repeat. Okay, so that's kind of a background. Now we can get into what does this actually mean to the degree we have an idea as yet. And as Nick says, we really are going to have to see the guidance from Treasury to have a better understanding. But this covers $5.6 billion that the state of Ohio is receiving as its portion of that $350 billion. Now, separately, there is also an almost equivalent amount going to local governments. And essentially, this provision is unlikely to cover local governments. But so essentially, you're talking about the $5.5 billion that the state of Ohio is receiving between now and 2024 for all of the purposes Nick mentioned and others that we can determine. Next slide, please. So to dive into the real wonkery here, what have we been doing along this line? Well, those of you paying close attention will know that just last week, the General Assembly passed a bill, Senate Bill 18. And what it does is it makes Ohio conform to the federal tax code. Now, Ohio, there are two different sets of states. Most states do use the federal tax code as the starting point for their own income taxes. And some states just simply codify what the feds do. They don't even have to act. Ohio, however, like many other states, does not automatically conform to the federal tax code. It requires an act of the General Assembly to do so. And until they do, we're still operating on the basis of the federal tax code the last time they did that, which in this case is about a year ago. So we've had a number of major acts of Congress that have taken place: the Continued Assistance Act, which was the COVID Relief Act at the end of last year, and the American Rescue Plan in particular, where Senate Bill 18 says Ohio will now conform to the federal tax provisions in those congressional acts. So what does that mean? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, and you can find more on this about this on our website if you're so inclined, there were a couple of provisions, particularly in the last COVID Relief Act, that were real giveaways, in particular regarding the Paycheck Protection loans, but also in reinstituting a full write-off for the what are called the 3 martini lunches, business meals, So there were some things that Congress did there that we don't consider to be very good tax policy that will cost Ohio tax revenue and will in fact go to some of the most wealthy Ohioans. At the same time, there were some good things in here. You may have seen, for instance, that under the rescue plan, the first $10,200 in unemployment benefits paid out last year is going to be exempted from income tax. And so that too would be exempt from Ohio income tax and will be under Senate Bill 18. There were some other provisions, for instance, broadening the earned income tax credit, making more people available. So on the whole, as I said, it's kind of a mixed bag. Treasury, of course, is going to have to decide, given that Ohio took this step and cut taxes by what our legislative staff estimate to be up to $200 million in this bill, is that going to conform? Is that act conforming to the Internal Revenue Code? Is that going to be okay because all we're doing is going along with what Congress itself wants? Or will they say, no, this violates or doesn't violate it? It is covered by the net tax provision in the bill. And, I think it would make more sense for them to frankly say, when you're just conforming to the federal tax code, since a bunch of states are likely to be able to do that anyway, we might as well allow all states to do it. So if I had to guess, I would say they would probably allow that, but we don't really know yet. Next slide, please. However, beyond simply conforming to the federal tax code, Senate Bill 18 also included some totally unrelated tax cuts. These included, for example, businesses not having to pay the commercial activity tax on all of that money that was paid back from the Workers' Comp Bureau, $6.8 billion worth last year. Also on the latest tranche of the Paycheck Protection Program loans. Again, commercial activity tax is not going to have to be paid. Those are additional tax cuts that have nothing to do with conforming to federal tax law, and to my mind, fall squarely within the purview of this provision. And so things being as they are, unless there's some really unusual guidance given by Treasury, we would have to pay that money back. How the General Assembly happened to do this without taking that into account is anybody's guess. I found that somewhat hard to believe, but who knows what they're thinking. Maybe they're thinking, as Nick said, that Yost will win his court case, or maybe they don't care. Or maybe they don't think we need to take the money at all is also a possibility. Beyond the Senate Bill 18, which has already passed, there of course are a host of tax bills now in the General Assembly. There's a list as long as my arm of new tax credits, ranging from one for, it's called a mega tax credit for big new investments. There's one for disposable diapers, the sales tax on that. I mean, you name it. You may have seen also that there's a much broader attempt to actually repeal our major business tax, the commercial activity tax, which would most certainly be a major tax cut and come under this provision. Next slide, please. I think another point about the earned income tax credit, since I know that we and others on this call have been working on this for a long, long time and trying to get our EITC to be refundable, is that even if Treasury should decide not to do what Nick suggested, and say, well, no, making a EITC refundable would in fact be covered by this provision, we can pay for that. In fact, Policy Matters Ohio has a proposed tax plan which calls for raising the income tax rate on people making over $220,000 a year, reinstating a corporate profits tax, and getting rid or limiting certain unnecessary tax loopholes, all of which would pay for a refundable earned income tax credit many times over. And so if we did any or even a small part of those revenue increases, we could also create a refundable EITC, and it would certainly have no problem qualifying under this language. As I began to mention earlier, the language in the Rescue Act pretty clearly, I think, doesn't cover local tax cuts. This is for the state. And of course, that opens up, I think, a certain possibility of things happening at the local level that they might want to take advantage of, although I certainly wouldn't encourage. We also, I think, could well expect that there may be tax cuts proposed in the biennial budget bill. As we know, in the last budget bill, we saw tax cuts. And given that the budget situation has improved since last spring, it wouldn't be too surprising to see the House or the Senate or both put forward cuts, tax cuts in the biennial budget, which to my mind are almost certain to require repayment under this provision. And so I think that underlines how important this provision is, and frankly, how good it is, how it is that for the first time here that I can think of, beyond our policy arguments about why these kinds of tax cuts have not been productive and are unlikely to be. We've had 15 years of failure. Why do we want to repeat it again? We also have the federal government behind us. And so I think that's, an incredible positive, and one that I hope we will all monitor and pay attention to because it can help us, I think, in this biennial budget process, but also in relation to all of these other kinds of bills that we've already seen. So I think that pretty much wraps up my presentation, and we could take questions.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Zach and Nick. And please, folks, feel free to either queue in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask questions at this point. We want to make sure that this is a discussion opportunity, and fire away. There's a lot of information. My goodness, you stunned them all.
Apparently.
Nick Bates has a question. Nick Bates. All right, in the chat, this question is for Nick. Conservative pushes in other states to encourage legislators to reject federal funds.
Yeah, it's a mix. I've seen some elected officials suggesting, oh, we don't really need the federal funds. But I also think much more common is policymakers using this argument that the federal government just can't impose this constraint. So basically wanting the money without the strings. So we can go ahead and cut taxes. I think, honestly, the cavalierness with which some states have cut taxes suggests to me that, in a sense, the we don't need it theme is part of their thinking, because they're being awfully blithe about it. But explicitly, they are tending to say, no, federal government can't do that. That would violate the be a 10th Amendment problem, and we're just going to go ahead and push ahead with tax cuts. I also think we're at the point in legislative sessions where we don't entirely know how much of it is bluster and how much of it is real. So there are states that have cut taxes, but there are other states where, for instance, there were tax cuts underway, and legislators may feel like they have to at least make a show of advancing a tax cut, but when they actually get to the negotiating table and have to sort out a budget, they may back down and not through on what they've been talking about. So it's a little hard to know right now.
I would add, we've had two congressmen in Ohio, Turner and Gibbs, specifically say, no, let's not take the money, and as well as some local elected officials. And I think what's interesting about that is it really undercuts Yost's argument, because his argument is this is a gun to the head. He tries to quote John Roberts and make it seem as if Ohio simply has to take the money. There's no alternative. And yet you have two congressmen saying, no, let's not take the money. Well, obviously, if we have, some of our key elected officials saying we shouldn't take the money, it's not a gun to the head. So I think that in some level that whatever you think of the argument of not accepting it, it really gives the lie to Yost's whole concept, frankly.
All right, thank you both. Next question is from our friend Will Petrick. I think this is directed towards you, Zach. So what does Senate Bill 18 and within it the move to conform with the federal tax code mean for Ohio's EITC?
Well, it means that we will go ahead and include the positive changes that were made both in the Continued Assistance Act, the one at the end of last year, and in the American Rescue Plan. So it means that people will be able to use 2019 earnings if they had earnings in 2020 that made them less able to qualify for the EITC. They'll be able to use the 2019 earnings instead. And it also broadens participation in the credit in who can receive it, particularly for childless workers. And so I think that that's another one of the positives in the conformity bill that is a good reason why allowing conformity to fit in under this provision makes sense.
Got it. Thank you. I do. So I have one question. So what does our dear Attorney General Yost's lawsuit mean for these dollars flowing out to states or to just Ohio? Will there be any kind of holdup because of the litigation? Kind of what could that mean for resources actually getting out from the American Rescue Plan?
That's a good question. I am not a lawyer, so I don't know the specific details. I can't think of any reason why it would hold things up. I haven't heard anything to that extent. And certainly Treasury is going to be extremely thoughtful and careful in how they draft the guidance, and they want to make sure that it is going to withstand legal muster, but I suspect they would have done it anyway. So I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference from a sort of the process at the federal level. I don't know, Zach, if you think there's going to be any implications for what the legislature does.
I wouldn't think so. I mean, in the sense that he sees this as money we have to accept, Yost isn't going to be out there asking for the money not to be spent, not to be given. I mean, that would be kind of contradictory for him. And so who would actually even be asking for that? Unless somebody else intervenes, or it would strike me as unlikely that this would interrupt that. Plus, much of this is supposed to arrive pretty quickly. So
Yost really should be in the legislature saying, don't you people know you have a gun to your head? Don't cut taxes.
Well, I mean, it was even interesting how he did this on his own when all of these other Republican attorneys general sent this. In fact, when they sent that letter, I think, where's Yost? Well, he was filing his own suit. So that was, I don't know that, the dynamics there of why he didn't join with all the others, but it was interesting.
You just wanted to be a wild card. We'll never know, as usual. So any questions, other questions for Zach or Nick today? So seeing none right at the moment. So sounds like we are awaiting the federal guidance to come out. Any timeline, projections, or any idea when we might see kind of those rules come down from the Treasury?
Yeah, I think it's weeks. They probably won't want to quite. The White House this week is unveiling this big infrastructure plan, so they might not want to step on that. I have not heard officially or unofficially what the exact timing is, but I would think it would be, fairly soon, as I said, weeks rather than months. And they do have an obligation. They do need to start moving the money soon.
Yeah, you'd hope that they would do it before most of the money starts flowing, but not that they have to. But and I think some of that was supposed to be within 60 days, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So,
and they know that, and they also know that legislatures are acting, as we said in the FOB. It's important. There's another precedent around that requires that the federal government do be giving clear guidance on how federal funds must be spent. If you're gonna tell the states how to spend it, then you have to tell them how to. You have to be clear about it. And so I think the longer we wait,
Last question from me, and thank you for entertaining these. So sounds like the federal or the state has until 2024 to spend these dollars. Will they get them all at once or in increments?
they get it in. Oh gosh, I'm blanking. The legislation went through some different changes. I think they get it in 2 tranches, right, Zach? Or do they?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. You know, I should know that too, but
It was going through some negotiations. So
yeah. One other thing that was just in the chat, which I would bring to people's attention, Professor Jonathan Enton of Case Western Reserve University wrote an op-ed in Crane's Cleveland Business on this from a legal standpoint. He was on the call earlier. I think he had to take off. But if you're interested in the legal side of this, I would highly recommend reading that. And it can give you more of an explanation of why, from a legal standpoint, Yost is wrong. And, you know, we're on solid legal ground supporting this measure. So for those of you interested in that aspect of it.
Fantastic. Well, it looks like that might do it for today, everyone. And Nick and Zach, I want to thank you so much for your time and for your presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I know folks as well did. We will again be providing the recording of this meeting to the folks who did register, maybe couldn't join us today, and happy to spread it around as well. Great information, and we will keep our ears open for any updates from the federal government and make a quick update when that Treasury guidance does make its way down. I think that may be a good plan moving forward.
Great. Thanks very much.
All right. All right. Well, everyone, thank you. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.